So this is from, let me go ahead and I guess, so this is from this Pathwork book that you can get on Kindle called Creating Union, and it is a compilation of the Pathwork lectures that are connected with relationship. And so uh, I want to just read these introductions, and there may be some commentary even there and questions. So, feel free to just chime in. So it says that this is the to the reader. The chapters in this book were originally delivered as lectures designed for people who wish to follow a path of intensive spiritual and psychological development. The words you will read are meant to affect areas of the soul accessible when you attune deeply to yourself. Then you will hear within an echo that reaches beyond a mere intellectual theoretical grasp of the material. You'll have an inner experience that says, yes, this is true. These teachings touch the deepest levels of my being. Those who seriously pursue a path of self awareness will eventually make use of the wisdom contained in these lectures in much more skillful way than those who merely read them without doing the necessary personal work. The difference is distinct. Being affected deep within your being will enable you to come more into reality and to understand your problems in a profound way, and thus to transcend yourself. Complete understanding may come only as the layers of your psyche open up and become accessible to your awareness. So, as you settle down to read this book, be receptive and open your mind and your heart. At the end of the book, you will find a short biography of the author and an explanation of how this material came into being. So, I thought I would just kind of briefly share here, some of these interesting titles that we're going to get into. So, it starts with part one of the cosmic principles and psychological concepts. And so, chapter on relationship and a chapter on the masculine and feminine principles in the creative process, which is a kind of connected and deeply profound metaphysical type of lecture. And then it comes back into, exploring this deep, relationship of a, made of a personal connection through the forces of love, eros, and sexuality, and the understanding of the spiritual significance of relationship, and ultimately, how we need this mutuality, and it's as a cosmic principle and law. And then part two is how to discover and overcome obstacles to a fulfilling relationship. So there's the desire for unhappiness and the fear of loving that most of us encounter at some level of our being. There's a real valid desire to be loved that we need to connect with, and then there's this kind of objectivity and subjectivity in relationship. A very profound and important lecture in the Pathwork is this compulsion to recreate and overcome childhood hurts, which deals with, our early vulnerability and the trauma of being that vulnerable, and how we learn to try to protect ourselves, but also how we, felt like we needed to, you know, sort of master that early environment. We felt defeated somehow by it. So it's a good lecture. And then chapter 10 is about the attachment of the life force to negative situations. And then life, love, and death, from the unconscious negative interaction to the conscious choice of love. And then part three is the relationship in an expanded age of consciousness. And so um, I don't know. We'll see. We might go into these. We'll talk a little bit about this. I find, some of these lectures, given where we are, and they were, delivered between 1957 and 78, are a little dated around sort of our new understanding of gender. And the guide actually speaks of that, and yet there is in that era a much more binary understanding of relationship. But it doesn't need to be applied that way from these lectures. And you can think of these lectures, as applicable to any relationship of any, combination of, people that are looking to, deeply connect in a vulnerable way. So it says real love is freedom. It can stand the test of truth. And this is an introduction. If life is a school, relationship is its university. It is through our relationships, especially through our relationship with our love partner, that we can learn and grow most. And here's where, we have this little note about, the binary level of it. So we are born man and woman, and we long for each other and we need each other. So I would say in this day and age, that, yeah, we are each born maybe, biologically man or woman, but each of us is our own unique combination of sort of the balance of the masculine and feminine principles. And so we are each unique, and there's, like a million billion different combinations, right? So it's not a binary situation anymore. And we understand that. And I think the guide really did in the way that he works with it. But he also understood sort of these deep archetypes of the masculine and the feminine, and in many relationships, that's, also what's being enacted here. So, but whatever relationship, he says, we long for each other. We need each other. We need to become united with the other physically, emotionally, and spiritually. This longing is built into our genetic codes, and searching for a partner with whom one can build a deeply satisfying relationship is at the very center of human life. Yet it is rare to find a couple whose relationship remains vibrantly alive through years of being together, who keep having joy and contentment in each other's company, year after year. A couple who welcomes each new challenge as yet another opportunity to learn to love more deeply. Why are there so few such relationships? From looking at the statistics, one would conclude that to live with another person in such a state is possible only for a limited time. Where does the spark of love go? This book offers deep, wise, and practical guidance towards answering these and many other questions. First, it illuminates the man-woman, maybe masculine, feminine archetypal conflict against the background of a vast context of cosmic forces. It presents this conflict from a perspective that is beyond our usual everyday dualistic awareness. From this vantage point, we can look into our hearts and souls with a new understanding. We learn, for instance, that not only is humanity in a state of duality, divided into multiple dualities, but a major one is the masculine and feminine. And not only do we perceive everything in dualistic terms, mainly as good or bad, right or wrong, okay or not okay, but also that division reaches further, and that each one of us is also conflicted within our own soul. And so we are not in harmony with ourselves. However, the conflicted self can be healed. A healthy self can then become ready to love and give in a more open way, meeting the other person in truth. How we can recognize and identify the inner conflict and how we can heal it are the topics of this book. If you give it your full attention, you will find that these teachings are truly unique in their scope, as well as in their applicability. Also, they are valid both for heterosexual and same-sex relationships. The history of anyone's relationships reveals the inner landscape of that person's being. From such a history, one can deduce the person's beliefs about life, the opposite sex, love, sexuality in general, marriage, and so on. If you learn to look at yourself honestly with a somewhat detached but nevertheless passionate, curious interest, you will be surprised at what you discover Most often it will come as a surprise to realize that it was you who created, or at least co-created, the present state of your relationship or the lack of it. It did not just happen to you without your contribution. When you realize that you are not a total victim, you instantly become more hopeful. You understand that you can learn to create differently. So it's interesting because I haven't had a chance to listen to it all, but I'm aware that NPR is kind of doing this 4-part series on sort of this realization that we're kind of having this cultural moment of realization of, the depth of isolation that everybody feels in our world, and especially in our culture. And so, I think, there are definitely as well collective levels of what we're experiencing, and, reasons that are, kind of in these larger contexts as well as in our personal contexts. But the more that we can understand that, the more that we can, learn to create differently. And so I've got this section highlighted a little bit because, this is where the author is, sort of talking about self-responsibility. And I find that, there's a deep, deep truth about self-responsibility, but I also find that it's important for it to be, talked about or understood, without like the historic shame, judgment, kind of thing, which even if it's not there, we often internalize, and we have an internal part that does that to us. So I want, as I read this, I'm going to try to read this in the most open, loving, accepting way that I can feel. And yet I want you also to notice, like, how do you receive it? Can you take it in from there? Do you notice still that you have the cringe effect, which is kind of what happens to me when when I hear some of this, and I feel like it's kind of confrontative in a way, and it's, I think we need to be in truth about it, and I think in some ways, Eva saw a culture that was a lot in its mask, and so she, and the pathwork in general, the guide kind of came through sometimes, and yet there was one time when I would read the lectures, I would hear this very confrontative voice. And then I heard another person reading the lectures one time, and that voice he was, speaking in was a very loving, accepting voice. And I realized, oh, I'm projecting, it's like I'm hearing my internal self-judgments, which is good to see. But it really helped me to realize that, we can hear this, level of kind of confrontation and self-responsibility, you know, within the context of a loving, challenge for us. So he says, you will challenge the belief that any trouble in your relationship is caused by outer circumstances or the other partner. If only he or she would change, how perfect life would be, is kind of our usual feeling, right? Of course, this is the greatest fallacy. Even if we assume that you are an angel and your husband, wife, or companion is a fiend, aren't you responsible for choosing and staying with such a partner? But we are not assuming that you are an angel. You and I know that we have an angelic light inside of us, which we can call the higher self, a loving, caring, selfless, creative core. But we also know that there is a less benign layer around that divine core, the selfish, vindictive, distrustful lower self, which is responsible for the many pains we suffer and inflict on others, especially on those closest to us. Without getting acquainted with this layer, without finding out how it came into existence, without owning up to it, we cannot transform it, no matter how hard we try to pretend that this layer doesn't exist. And this voice of ugly layer, I want to jump over that, because I don't know that there's any ugliness in us, right? I think there's a reason for all of the layers that exist in us. I think we are all doing the best that we know how, but yeah, we have kind of taken, because we're not seeking, and because there's not so much guidance everywhere in the world. It's like there's kind of like this basic egoic programming in the world, um, that most of us grew up with. So we just kind of are trying to help ourselves recognize that we want to take this on, and that we want to take it on from the place of that light within us, and not from our own self-judgment. We already have enough of that. Hopefully we'll get into some of the healing for that, because that is what creates the whole thing spinning. And so mostly, the path work in the old days, and when Judith was doing this, was like what was revolutionary was looking at the lower self, and still is. We need to do our shadow work. We need to take, and go into the unconscious. Shadow is not just bad, negative, evil stuff. Shadow is just the unconscious, and shadow is in the body, and we hold the energies, these beliefs, these misconceptions, all of these kinds of things, like inside of us, and we don't even really recognize that we're living out our lives through them. And so just by waking up and seeing them, it can help a lot. And when we have shame about, what we're doing about that, then we don't want to see it. So that kind of defeats this, need to, like really welcome whatever is within us, and trust that whatever is within us is here for a reason, is a teacher for us, doesn't make us bad in any way. And we're here learning how to clear some old tapes, old programs, so we can step into the full beauty of who we all really are. So let me pause here. Any comments, questions so far? Okay. So I think Judith is writing this intro, and she goes on. She says, many problems in the area of relationship are caused by feelings and thoughts that are buried in the unconscious. Such unexamined thoughts and feelings have their own erroneous, childish logic. They cause conflicts in the soul. And if there is a war within your own soul, how can you have a healthy relationship with someone else? The contradictory, unresolved feelings and thoughts within the self need to be brought to light first. But how do you recognize the inner conflicts? And how can you work towards resolving them? This may not be easy, and you may need help to find your way into your inner hidden world. What is unconscious must be brought into consciousness. There are ways to do this. Once you gain access to your inner world, you will find that you are harboring beliefs that you never knew you had. With proper guidance, you will unearth hitherto unconscious feelings. What do you really believe about loving, about marriage, underneath the predictable answers that you would glibly give? Some surprising answers may come from your depths, such as, if I love, I will be hurt. If I show my feelings, I will be rejected. Marriage is slavery. I'm not supposed to be happy. These and similar misconceptions, and many, many other different types of misconceptions, and they are misconceptions, certainly they're not the truth, need to come to the surface because they determine your attitude toward relationship. They're not the truth because they're totally overgeneralized, right? And they're these, kind of predictive sorts of things. And part of where we're, trying to meet life was faith and openness, faith in ourselves, faith in God, faith in each other, in this kind of undefended, more open place. But of course, we've got history where we've gotten burned that way. And so now we have all of these layers of protection and defense and trying to, you know, take care of ourselves. But what we discover in the long run is that those defenses, they don't really help, and they actually kind of recycle all of the patterns and difficulties in our relationship dynamics. So they act like magnets, becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. This is why people recreate again and again the same unfulfilling patterns. So this is another way that, we need to think about, like creating our own reality. I mean, maybe we create some of the difficulty, like, we're afraid to speak our truth, and so we don't speak, and then of course nobody hears us or sees us or understands it, so there's a kind of vicious circle there if we're not going to speak, because and we don't speak because we don't believe anybody's going to listen. So this kind of thing traps us in these little boxes, and in some way we have to risk just keep speaking even if nobody listens, right? And eventually somebody might. But this feeling of disappointment and pain when nobody listens is this old wound, and every time it happens again we kind of fall into this deep well of trauma, of pain, of self rejection, because somehow out of that we draw a conclusion that something is wrong with us, that you know we're you know not able to be in these relationships because we're not okay, we're not good enough.
Darlene,
Uh-huh.
um, I just wanted to go back a little bit about the ugly layer within us
Uh-huh.
and how we take in that message. It's
Yeah, where is that? Keep going.
um so being that this is channeled through spirit, right? Which
Uh-huh.
gives us like which gives it the lecture's authority. Um it's hard not to take it personally and say, "Oh, yeah, there is something wrong with us," because it's being channeled through an authority above us, which is spirit. Uh,
Okay, so good question. First of all, I want to point out that the word ugly, I don't know if the guide uses that. This is not channeled material, what we're reading now. This is
okay.
an introduction by a woman by the name of Judith Saley, who is, an old, like first generation path worker, new Eva, et cetera, et cetera. And I know at that time, people were very much in their masks, and so kind of like the pathwork was a little bit in the community, sort of like into it was the time also in the 60s and stuff like that when you had encounter groups, and confrontation was kind of like an in thing, right? Because we were breaking through into our real feelings for the first time in a lot, our lifetimes. And so I think um, I think there is some way that sometimes these things seem like they're pointing in this negative way. The guide does talk about our immature child consciousness, and so what happens is I think we're the ones that judge it as ugly. He talks also about our personal lower self, like our ability to be selfish, right? That kind of thing. Our pride, self-will, and fear, right? And those things do cause harm to others as well as to ourselves. So, in some way, we want to face that layer, and we have a kind of natural tendency to want to hide it. So, uh, most of our unconscious is sort of busy trying to appear certain ways, or trying to, you know, uh, keep that hidden, and even from ourselves, right? So this is where I think if we can look at, yeah, we're not perfect, we have faults, we have imperfections, but that's kind of like, well, if we look at it as we're children and we're growing, it's like saying, oh, a 2-year-old is ugly and a 20-year-old is elegant, right? It's like, well, a 2-year-old is a 2-year-old, and a 2-year-old is a beautiful 2-year-old doing its 2-year-old thing and learning and growing. And sometimes those 2-year-olds, have a difficult time of it and get trapped and lost in some, pain bodies that came out of that 2-year-old experience. And then their 2-year-old, even though they grow, they still have a part of them that's 2-year-old. And I know there's a part of me like that, um, sometimes it comes out inappropriately in in the world, in a way that, my 2-year-old is going to throw a tantrum. And oftentimes, the snowflakes in the world find it quite quite disturbing. It's like they want, and there's a truth that I don't want to just justify it, right? But there's some way in which we can, have our imperfections and allow ourselves to understand and integrate them within us, and then we will naturally rebalance and change. And even things like aggression, self-will, right? It's like, it's not about getting rid of stuff, it's about realizing that there's a divine kind of positive aggression, and then in the wounding and the difficulty, we end up kind of going to a negative aggression. And our job is really not to get rid of all aggression, it's to transform the negative aggression into the positive aggression. So it's a little more nuanced than sort of the way that the dualistic mind wants to work. This is good, bad, right, wrong, get rid of that, fix that, change that, and make that wrong, and beat on that, or, you know, uh, humiliate somebody else, humiliate yourself, right? Shame yourself, feel shamed by others, feel shame from yourself to yourself. All of these things, are ways that these unconscious parts of us are in some ways trying to help us grow. But they do a terrible job of it, and it doesn't work at all. It ends up crippling us. And when we're crippled internally in our relationship with ourself, we can't really be in a relationship very, successfully outside. It will be a codependent relationship. And sometimes we find those, and but they're usually not really what we're looking for. And they usually create a lot of frustration, because we're trying to get the other person to, do something that we're not doing for ourselves in a way. So that goes back to that self-responsibility again. Does that help?
Yeah. Uh, it kind of explains why, like, kind of the arrows attaches to people that might not be right for you.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's it's like we're seeing through that unconscious lens, and so that's a part of where it's useful. So she gives an example going forward here, from her own practice, that might be, relatable. I don't or there's many other examples, but she says, a very attractive, professionally successful young woman came to me with the complaint that she always falls in love with married men. They develop a secret relationship that is exciting, but also painful and guilt producing. Ultimately, they break up and she is heartbroken. Right now, she finds herself again in such a relationship. What can she do? Now, don't think that the misconception underlying this pattern came to light immediately. No, it took months before it all came out. This is what emerged. Her father had been an alcoholic, and when he was drunk, he was very different from when he was sober. But she, the daughter, was his favorite, and to her, he was always nice, even when he was brutal with his wife. So the little girl came to the conclusion, but of course this quickly came buried in her unconscious, that a man has two sides, a good one and a bad one. And she did not want the bad side. She only wanted the good side. That is, she only wanted half a man. His other half, his bad half, let his wife have it. So she ended up in these relationships where she was not in a fully committed, relationship with the guy. So when she blurted out this sudden realization in the course of relating a dream, we were quite stunned, as you may well imagine. We just looked at each other speechless. Soon after, she was able to break up with her married lover, and within a year, she actually became attracted to a different kind of man, one who was not married. She was no longer in the thrall of her misconception. Now she was willing to accept the whole man, even his bad side. This happened 20 years ago, and they are still married. I hope this illustration gives you an idea of what I have in mind when I say that it is well worth it to dig for one's misconceptions. When they come to the surface, you have a good chance at discontinuing your self-defeating patterns. The Pathwork teachings give us very practical instructions on how to discover ourselves and how to do the work of transformation, with or without the cooperation of your partner, with or without being in a relationship. They teach us how to get from where we are, even if that's no relationship, to where we want to be. These are not superficial exercises, but methods that imply a willingness to open one's eyes, to face oneself in truth without sentimentality. Such commitment brings immense reward, psychological and spiritual growth, authenticity, joy. From these follow the capacity to establish a relationship with a partner, equally prepared to relate, reveal, and reciprocate. And so that's what we're really looking for, right? Usually if we're at this level and we're doing this work, and we may not be great at it ourselves, but we have a sense that that's what we're looking for. And we keep trying and we can't quite figure it out. It doesn't seem to work. But, like acknowledge that, yeah, this is what you want, a partner who's equally wanting like you to relate, to reveal, and to reciprocate. And you may have tried in all good faith to put the other first, give unconditional love, be patient, never threatened, always stay calm and kind, or, strong and manly, or whatever your, image is. Such noble resolutions can't work for long when they are superimposed on layers and layers of unresolved conflicts, not only with your partners, but also within your own soul. There is no way around it. You cannot transcend before you transform. This is why, if you want to make changes in your relational life, or want to find the right person, or genuinely improve your relationship, you need to find the roots of your problems. When you know and accept yourself as you are now, including your lower self, you build on a solid foundation. So these chapters will give you astonishing insights into the nature of the male and female forces in the universe and the spiritual meaning of this particular aspect of our dualistic existence that also is about relationship. And so here she's talking more metaphysically, right? And in some ways, if you can think of it, the difference, like we live in a world where we need polarity. It's different than duality. And the fundamental polarities, are night and day, hot and cold, right? Male and female. And those polarities are part of what creates the magnet that creates the energy that allows creation to unfold, right? And so, it's like what we're talking about here is that we all need relationship, to open us to see more, to see each other more fully, all of that, and in that kind of polarity and integration of the opposite of the other, I think is the word she used, right? We find more and more of ourself, as well as more and more of our, openness and ability to love. So you can safely take the journey into the jungle of your inner land, because you will be led through the brambles and thickets to the higher self that exists within you, and from which all the answers that are personally yours will come to a most natural and simple way. So here's where, like if we can have that courage to just kind of go through what seems to be the ugly of ourselves, right? That, there's a way that this is what also creates or awakens the higher self within us, because we begin to uh, feel the dignity of our being in our willingness and in our, ability to confront ourselves, to face ourselves, to see ourselves clearly, right? And so there's this whole thing about, one of the lectures on dignity in humility, acceptance, right and wrong. I think it's lecture 37. But, I find that, the pride and shame that are kind of the two sides of that aspect of our lower self, um, can be really unified. That duality becomes a polarity when it is this thing that you would say is dignity in humility. And I don't know if you can feel in yourself, like, because if we can, this is where we can sense our own inner conflict, because if we are judging or rejecting ourselves and we see, our weaknesses or some of our faults or whatever, that's kind of pride and shame that we're locked into within ourselves, right? And so, we can't perfect ourselves in any kind of meaningful way. It takes a lifetime at least, probably lots more. But we don't want to deny our divinity, and we don't want to kind of over extend it, right? Or put too much stake in it, right? So I find, sort of this, having this dual kind of balance of inner dignity. Can you feel that? What it feels like to have inner dignity? And also, a kind of basic humility. You're not great, you're not grand, you have your faults, but you're beautiful, you're fabulous, you're a creation of God, you're amazing, you know. Uh, and so we can have this, true sense of, I think dignity is standing in the spiritual truth of our, that we are children of God. And we can stand in the dignity of that. God doesn't make crap, right? Um, but we're also imperfect. We're children. We're messed up. We're growing. We're lost from other lifetimes, whatever, So, we know we don't have all the answers. We know we don't know everything. We know we're lost in many ways and need help. And so that's where humility comes in, when we can, seek that help and not, instead of like Adam and Eve, when God came into the garden after they messed up, they ran and hid, right? Uh, I find that, we need to find this other movement, when we've messed up, we want to run to God and say, help me, show me, forgive me, like we want to run into God's arms, not run away from God, not separate, but go into seeking the truth, the clarity, the healing. So let's see if we can go ahead and go forward on, I think, the next chapter, to see where, let's see, did I finish this? So yeah, says, as you read the chapters, hear the voice of wisdom, not only open up your mind, but also become receptive in your whole self. Imagine yourself in the presence of a being of greater love and deeper wisdom than you have ever encountered before. The blessings given at the beginning and end of each chapter carry divine energy. Let them penetrate your soul. So Judah Saley was actually, like I said, an early path worker, and she came from, I think, Hungary, and was part of the diaspora of the World War II situation. And I'm not sure if she's still alive, but she was very active, and as maybe still even alive. She was in her late 90s, I think, a while back. So anyway, so let's go into part one, and this is again an introduction to a section. So we're not quite reading the guide's words themselves yet. So, cosmic principles and psychological concepts. And the two shall be one. The words often heard at a marriage ceremony refer to much more than two people beginning a life together. It is a cosmic statement. Two, duality, is the basic condition of our existence on earth. And one is the state of unity from which we have separated ourselves and to which we long to return. Since the state of duality is a split from oneness, from paradise, it contains pain. We long to return to our lost state of bliss. Transforming that in ourselves, which is the cause of our separateness, of our inability to relate well, and to allow the unhindered flow of love, is the goal of the pathwork of relationship. Every spiritual path shows a way from self-alienation to self-finding, and therefore God-finding. The teachings in this book follow ancient esoteric traditions, yet they are contemporary in their exquisite comprehension of human psychology. Unity contains all, and therefore also the divine principles underlying our earthly duality. The masculine and feminine energies are whose flesh and blood manifestations we, men and women, are. The material in the first part of the book describes these cosmic principles and explains how they relate to the spiritual meaning and psychology of the man-woman relationship. Seen from this greater perspective, the struggles we all make to find a love partner, to keep that love alive, to continually deepen that love, takes on a new depth and dignity. For in this endeavor, we are not only doing the work of overcoming our fears of giving up our separateness in order to claim for ourselves a richer and happier life, but we are also co-creators in a great cosmic movement, that of the further evolution of the universe. Our yearning for a deeper union in love with another is so compellingly powerful because of its cosmic significance. Here we see the link between our individual temporal lives and the greater reality that encompasses us. Understanding the functioning of the masculine and feminine principles in the universe will vastly enrich your comprehension of the significance of your personal yearning for a deeper union in love with another. Embark on this flight of imagination into a new space. Be a cosmic traveler in return with new insights and new hope. Okay, so let me pause again and just see any comments or questions. I think we still have time. I don't know if we'll get the entire chapter finished, but we'll continue.
Darlene, I have a sense that we yearn for our soulmate, and whoever we get in relationship with, we try to mold them into who we think our perfect mate, soulmate might be. And that's where all the trouble begins.
Right, right. Exactly. And I think the guide suggests maybe that, that we're also sort of like trying to still win the love from, the people that we didn't get it from, right? And so there's kind of both of those angles. We're trying to find that perfect, reflection of maybe our inner anima or animus and like that perfect partner that we hope to find. And again, I think there is this, way that that's the partnership we need to give to ourselves in some ways. I know when I do the work of sort of the objective observer or the loving witness, right? You know, I feel like I'm stepping into a place that sees and befriends me, you know, deeply, and is a beloved or is a lover or is, you know, I don't know what the gender deal is, you know, like, but that place is very much sort of in the feminine, and then my ego is sort of the active masculine in the way that they talk about it, I think, in the lectures on the cosmological principles of it. And so I think in some ways we are trying to create this presencing of ourselves and a container to witness ourselves, you know, and see ourselves as the beloved. And that's something that I think is rare, because we have this very hyperactive inner critic, idealized self-image, you know, kind of program, and that you know came out of, I think, the hurts, the childhood hurts. So, but yeah, exactly. You know, and most people I do, you know, find, you know, they just want to change their partner to be the way they think the partner should be. And
Or the way they would love their partner to be,
right.
you know.
And it's kind of like, yeah, it's like it becomes a tug of war, it becomes, you know, a kind of, you know, anything but a unifying relationship. It's a split that is projected, I think, from outside, from inside of us outside onto the relationship, and just can continue ad nauseum for sure.
Well, when you consider all the personality parts at play in just one person, and then multiply that by two, you've got pretty much about 10 personality parts floating around
Right,
the relationship at any given time,
right,
you know,
right. And
all
I think that's where it's so important to do our inner work, you know, so that we can own those parts, so we can become conscious of them and own them, and discover who they are and what they feel, and then, you know, a whole different way of relating can come forth. So a lot of the relationship work that couples try to do, I find, you know, they need to do a lot more of their own inner work first, um, or at least in conjunction.
yeah, for sure.
So yeah, it's like, but they don't want, you know, there's resistance. They want to change the other guy. Okay, so let's hear what the guide has to say about relationship. Greetings, my dearest friends. I welcome you and I bless you. What is life? Is a question asked by many. Life is relationship, my friends. Other answers can be given, and they may all be truthful, but above all else, life is relationship. If you do not relate at all, you do not live. Your life or your relationships are relative to your attitude. You may relate positively or negatively, but the moment you relate, you live. So he's even saying, you know, it's better to relate, you know, like we're all tied up into, you know, I got to relate a certain way, you know. He said, just relate. That is why the person who relates negatively is much more alive than the person who relates little. And it's kind of why sometimes, you know, we get aligned with, you know, our negative pleasure in relating negatively, right? And we kind of get trapped in that addiction to the negative pleasure. Destructive relationships lead to a climax that is ultimately bound to dissolve the destructiveness. But non-relating, usually under the guise of false serenity, is further down the scale. So I think that's important, you know, like again, in our way of looking at things, we often see the mask, you know, of the false serenity, and don't recognize that it's really a withdrawal and a non-relating kind of process. And so again, you know, the invitation is to come out, be real, express ourselves. You know, one of the things I loved about Pathwork and TP was, you know, when we would do movement and we could kind of externalize and just act out, you know, some of these energies within us in a exaggerated way, but it felt full and real and, you know, less inhibiting. So we have a lot of inhibition in our kind of masks. Every affliction of the psyche prevents relating to others. Fruitful relating can exist only to the degree the soul is healthy and free. But first, one has to understand more profoundly what relating is. The plan of evolution. Remember that the whole plan of evolution is about uniting, bringing together individual consciousnesses, for only in this way can separateness be given up. Union with an abstract idea, with an intangible God, or as a cerebral process is not really union. Only the actual contact of one individual with another establishes those conditions in the entire personality, and that are the prerequisites for true inner union and unity. Therefore, this pull manifests as a tremendous force, moving people toward each other, making separateness painful and empty. The life force is therefore permeated not only with the pull towards others, but also with pleasure supreme. Life and pleasure are one. Life, pleasure, contact with others, oneness with others are the goal of the cosmic plan. And I know, in my journey in the pathwork, there were many times when I kind of knew that truth but couldn't feel it at all. And it felt like contact with others was, not at all pleasurable, very fraught. I had a recent experience over the weekend where I was in community, and didn't know everybody all that well, knew some people, but I was just like totally in love with everybody there. And it was a total pleasure to have the contact with others. Now, these others were all, pretty much, of a certain level of consciousness, and awareness, and had their own capacity to love and connect, but in the overall picture, in the journey that I've made from where I was to there, I think we can all do that. And I can attest that, this pleasure and life and contact with others is, this unified, beautiful experience, and I think is the goal of the cosmic plan. And where we're struggling, is because we're working deeply there, to, set ourselves free, right? So, comments, questions? Relationships with all things and beings. You are used to associating the word relationship only with human beings, but in truth, this word applies to everything, even to inanimate objects, to concepts and ideas. It applies to the circumstances of living, to the world, to yourself, to your thoughts and attitudes. So we have relationships to all of these things. And, part of our Western difficulty is that we've severed our relationship to the world in serious ways, and we've severed our relationship to our body. It's part of like there's just this series of severances that we've all undergone in growing up in this kind of culture. And then, we have relationships to more likely to concepts and objects and ideas, but again, oftentimes they're not so conscious, they're not questioning ones, they're assumptions that we hold on to as identities, right? So it says it applies to the circumstances of living, to the world, to yourself, to your thoughts and attitudes. To the degree you relate, you will not feel frustrated, but will have a sense of fulfillment. So even when we relate, when we read a book, when we, engage in things, but I think in our world, we are in this kind of isolated thing. So I think we're trying to find a way to relate beyond our thoughts and attitudes a little more. And in I notice in more indigenous cultures and stuff, people are naturally sort of more heart-centered and more identified with, their feelings. And our Western culture is very much identified with our thoughts and attitudes. And so I think that does contribute. And part of what we want to do is kind of like see if we can drop down and connect more with our feelings, more with our heart. And that's a part of this trauma that we've all suffered in, being humiliated in relationship with authorities, with other people. So we're trying to heal a huge wounded place in us, and to understand it and to be able to stand with ourselves and hold those hurts is very important to do the healing. We have to feel them, but we can't feel them if we don't have a container. And like in TP, the group would be the container to some degree, but the truth container is ourselves. Each person has to learn to become their own container. And then to the degree we relate, we don't feel frustrated, but have a sense of fulfillment. So the scale of the possibilities of a relationship is very wide. Let us begin with the lowest form on earth, which is mineral. Since a mineral is without consciousness, and we can debate that even, you may believe that it does not relate. That is untrue. Since it lives, it does relate. But its degree of relating is limited to its degree of life. Or more correctly put, it is a mineral because it is incapable of relating more. The mineral relates by letting itself be perceived and used, and thus it relates in a completely passive way. The relating capacity of an animal is much more dynamic. It actively responds to other animals, to nature, and to human beings. So the ability to relate depends on the level of consciousness. The scale of the capacity to relate is much wider among human beings than you even remotely realize. Let us begin with those on the lowest scale among human beings. That would be the completely insane person who has to be put into solitary confinement, or the criminal who is not so different from the former. They are both completely withdrawn, live in outer and inner isolation. They can hardly relate to other human beings. But since they are alive, they must continue to relate somehow. They therefore relate to other aspects of life, to things, to their environment, even if it is in the most negative way, to food, to certain bodily functions, perhaps even to some ideas or art or nature. It should be very useful, my friends, to think about life and people from this point of view. Like it's a vast spectrum of our capacity for relating in consciousness. And again, in some ways it's not to be judged, it's not hierarchical. It's more like, we're here in some ways all exploring different aspects of ourselves. And so even a fairly advanced soul may have an incarnation where they may not bring in as much consciousness because they're exploring the experience of limitation in certain ways. Or there maybe you could consider they're working off some karma, from another lifetime or something like that. And so they chose, this kind of limitation. And all of incarnation is about choosing various limitations, also various strengths and capacities. But it's this, combination, and to understand that we chose them, it's like they're uniquely for us because they're part of our curricula in this lifetime. Okay, so now by contrast, let me immediately go to the highest form of human beings. These are people who relate beautifully, who are deeply involved with others, who are unafraid of involvement, who have no protective covering against experience and feeling. Therefore, they love. They permit themselves to love. In the last analysis, the ability to love always comes down to the inner willingness and readiness to do so. People belonging in this category love not only abstractly and generally, but they love personally and concretely, regardless of risk. Such people are not necessarily saints or holy or anywhere near perfect. They may have their faults. They may be wrong at times and may have negative feelings. But on the whole, they love, relate, and do not fear involvement. They have freed themselves from their defenses. So underscore that line. That's basically the difference between, the person that can do this and the person that can't, even though they may be more ready or more conscious, and longing for it, is that we're still operating under the illusion of our defenses. And defenses are illusions. So part of our, self-exploration is to recognize that, to see the defense and to understand why it's an illusion. Don't take the guide's word for it. Don't take my word for it. Know it in yourself so that you can then, choose deeper, choose something else. Find a way, to, jump off the cliff, to be vulnerable and naked without that defense, and see what really happens. But you're never going to do that until you've convinced yourself that that's just this quick slow death, or the quick swift death, and it's no worse. In fact, it probably is better than this long slow death that you've been cooking in over the lifetime. And so like we have oftentimes where we're in our defense, we're in this damned if we do, damned if we don't image place, and we've chosen unconsciously to kind of take the long slow death, the one that's not too risky. But if we really look at it, it seems safer, but the long journey basically doesn't give us what we want, and we suffer over time. We suffer ultimately in life from lack of fulfillment in life, and that's as big a death as jumping off the cliff and becoming totally humiliated or totally ruined by relationship in some way. So they have freed themselves from their defenses. Such people, in spite of occasional disappointments or setbacks, have a life full of fruitful, meaningful relationships. What is life for the average person? It is a combination of manifold possibilities. A person may be relatively free and relate well in certain areas of his or her life and be very much obstructed in others. Only deep personal insight will enable you to find the truth in this respect about yourself. When a relationship appears good on the surface but is devoid of depth and inner meaning, then it is easy to deceive oneself and say, look how many good friends I have. And this is probably what we see a lot out there. I mean, I think there are people that are capable of having good relationships, but a lot of them are fairly superficial acquaintances, that kind of thing. There's nothing wrong with my relationships, and yet I am unhappy, lonely, and unfulfilled. If this is how it is with you, it cannot be true that your relationships are good, or that you are truly willing to relate. You cannot be lonely and unhappy if your relationships aren't genuine. So it's like he's saying, like this risk of genuine, undefended realness, which is so scary, right, is the key. And that, we really can't be lonely and unhappy if we have genuine relationship.
Uh,
Go ahead, Davis.
um, Speaking of jumping off the cliff, um, so if Eros hits you and draws you to a certain relationship, even though it might not be good for you, do you still go for it and humiliate yourself, even though you possibly know the outcome of it, or?
Yeah, good question. So again, sometimes you have to do that to learn. Like I watch myself sometimes, like, I don't know, I don't see this clearly. I guess I'm just going to have to jump back in and do it again, to understand it more fully. But to the degree that you recognize, oh, this is a pattern and I have a feeling I know where this is going to end, it can be very useful to go inside and work with it internally, right? It's like if you've done it before, this dynamic lives in you. It's still alive in you. You can access it, and you can work it without trying to recreate it and re-experience it in life. So I would certainly, at least in conjunction, and maybe I think it's an interesting exploration within that inner work with a helper or something, where you would sort of explore, what your impulses are, what you would want to do, and then kind of look at them from this place of, defense and, image and all of that kind of stuff, right? And sort it out a little, and then maybe even come to a different kind of risk, a different way of genuinely revealing yourself, right? It's like in some ways, our initial feelings can be projections or, not really so much about the other person, right? We think they are. We're, that eros, that moment of eros. And the guy does say in Love, Eros, and Sex that, it's worth the risk in most instances, right? I would say the only time it's not is if you really do sense that you're just completely recreating an old pattern, and you could again do the inner work a bit before you take an outer risk. Does that help?
Yeah. Thank you.
So on the other hand, if the way in which you relate fulfills a superficial function only, then it may be pleasant and distracting, but somehow shallow. Your true self is never revealed, and therefore you are unfulfilled. Thus you also prevent others from relating, and do not give what they search for, whether or not they know it. This is due to your unconscious fear of exposure, letting your friends know about your various inner conflicts. So, and again, letting our, part of it is, that we don't know that we even have friends, right? And so exposure is often, fear of exposure to people that are going to use it against us, which would probably be more like an enemy, right? But we have to examine that fear of exposure, because it usually comes, from this shaming that was done. And if we can transform that, because it wasn't really, we weren't meant to carry that shame. That was like shame on them, not shame on us, right? And so by us taking that shame on and then, living out the isolation of it, I think that's a healing that we're trying to do. So, our fear of exposure is a good place of exploring and working. And then when we have friends, and again, this is part of with the Pathwork, trying to do groups and, that sort of thing, ideally within that context, you can explore what happens if I risk bringing this truth out. And in the Pathwork group, ideally the container is there so that if it goes south a little bit, or if people, you have a reaction, other people have a reaction, or whatever, it's like it can also be sort of examined like under a microscope to see, to understand, okay, what just happened. And that can lead to a deeper connection with each other, even though it might create a similar conflict or bad feeling initially. It's in the process of illuminating, some old wound. And if we can risk that and feel through it, we can free ourselves of it. So the average person has some capacity and willingness for involvement in relationship, but not enough. The drama of mutual exchange and communication takes place on a superficial level. Unconscious currents affect the involved parties. And that's the truth. We're always reading the unconscious currents in us. And if the shallow relationship is a close one, sooner or later it will cause a disturbance. If the shallow relationship never becomes close, nothing will happen, but neither can one deceive oneself that it is a real tie. So he's saying, like if it's going to grow, it may bring you into conflict. Because we can only be kind of superficially in a certain level of union. And then we have to kind of go on into a deeper descent to have deeper intimacy, to have deeper understanding, and to create a union at a deeper level. And initially, that's going to rock the boat probably, right? But he says it's worth doing, right? And it's you don't have to do it in a negative way. you can co-create that together in relationship if, both of you have the interest and the capacity for that. So, if it's a shallow relationship, then nothing is going to happen. And then, it's like, you can't really deceive yourself that there's something there. And that's what I hear a lot, really, is that people are around people that are in relationship, but none of them seem to have any kind of real tie. So, unconscious destructive tendencies can only be dissolved if one faces and understands them. This will not harm the relationship because then the communication will automatically take place on a more profound level, and there will be mutual exchange. It is often not clear to you what constitutes a profound and meaningful relationship. Is the criteria the mutual exchange of ideas, or is it the mutual exchange of sexual pleasure? Both may indeed be there, yet their presence will not necessarily make the communication very deep. In other words, you can talk about ideas, you can even have sex, but there may not be a very deep connection. The only true criteria is how genuine you are, how open and undefended, how willing you are to feel, to involve and express yourself, and all that really matters to you. How many people do you know to whom you can express your real sorrows, real needs, worries, longings, wishes? Very few, if any. To the degree you permit yourself to become aware of these feelings, you will find more friends with whom you can share and whose life you are capable of truly understanding. If you shy away from yourself, how can you be willing to communicate to others that which you do not dare to acknowledge to yourself? Thus, you must live in isolation and unfulfillment. This is why we are so very much concerned in our work of self-transformation, that you learn to admit the truth to yourself. Only then can you begin to have real relationships instead of false ones and lead a full life. Even when your relationships to other aspects of life, such as art, nature, ideas, will take on new forms that are very much alive, whereas before you may have used them to avoid troublesome feelings. So you can kind of go into nature to avoid things or just take a break or whatever. And I see a lot of people at my retreat, kind of just, running from the stresses of life, and yet when you really are in that deeper level of relationship, you can go into nature, you can do your art, in a much deeper way. And it's transformative in that, it's like doing a vision quest instead of just a let down and relax retreat kind of thing. So real relating and communication can be confused with the childish compulsion to tell everyone everything. So I love the way the guide does this, like he kind of always balances and helps us see that, we can often go into distortion and divinity on both sides of anything. And so here he's saying, yes, relate, communicate, communicate. But then he's talking about, so there's a distorted way that we can do that, where coming from the childish compulsion to tell everyone everything. And I can remember, feeling that way. And, maybe it still also is part of why I like to talk so much. I don't know. But you can feel that, right? Maybe inside of you, or you can feel maybe you're holding back and you don't hardly even recognize it in yourself, but you don't, you've suppressed it so much that that really is what you're afraid would come out if you did let yourself talk or share or start revealing yourself. You wouldn't know when to stop, or you would say something indiscriminately, as he says, share your feelings indiscriminately and jeopardize yourself in the misunderstanding that foolish candor or unwise exposure or cruel honesty are proof of your openness and willingness to relate, right? So you see how interesting that subtle looking at, these currents are. And so you might check inside of yourself, like when you think of your own holding back against your communication of yourself, are any of these possibly in there, in the underground, because the guide is saying, when we feel lower self in what we're doing, we hold it back. And so part of it is, again, this purification work before we can completely, but even in a relationship, where we're not totally, we're not perfect yet, if we can honestly admit our lower self currents in a way, or some of this is going on inside, then that helps. And especially if we can admit it to ourselves, because then we can do some work with it and maybe transform it. And then also if we're in a partnership, it's like we can take responsibility, we can apologize, we can, openly admit our part of this, which makes a huge difference for everybody. And you'll find in modeling it, you'll probably receive it as well, which, is very beautiful. So, if we're in this kind of foolish candor or unwise exposure or cruel honesty, and as proof of our openness and willing to relate, he says, in reality, this merely covers up your withdrawal on a much more hidden level and in a more subtle manifestation. Thus, you can produce the proof that it does not pay to involve yourself, right? So if we come into relationship with these kind of negative elements and we try to share ourselves, but we have this little twist of the lower self in there, sometimes we're actually intentionally doing that from our lower self part, because then we can prove to ourselves that it doesn't pay to risk to involve ourselves. So does that make sense? So with true understanding and consequent liberation from your self-constructed prison, there will be nothing strained in your self-revelation and your relationships. So that's beautiful, right? With true self-understanding and the consequent liberation from your self-constructed prison, there will be nothing strained in your self-revelation and your relationships. You will intuitively choose the right people and the right opportunities and the right manner. Occasional misjudgments will never crush you or put you back into hiding. But the organic growing process, the freedom, comes only gradually and only after you have started to pursue a path of self-knowledge. Psychiatrists often diagnose people according to their ability to relate and the depth of meaningfulness of their relationship. It has been found that some of the more severely disturbed people can receive help more easily than those others whose disturbance is less obvious, because the latter can deceive themselves and pretend that they are not so bad and continue to hide it from the truth within. This subterfuge is not available to those who are more disturbed. This was my case, right? And many of the people that I think come to the Pathwork, we come because, we can't hide our flaws, or we don't have great masks or whatever, and so we can't pretend that everything is okay. And they therefore come to a point where they have to make a choice to look at their inner life squarely without self-deception. They may also have a severe breakdown which will postpone self-confrontation, but they are near the point of decision, which they may reach only in the following life, than the less neurotic person who continues to evade self-confrontation. Many of you, my friends, do not have a clear concept of what it is to really relate or love. Your concern is mainly centered around yourself. If you are outgoing to others, it is not a natural, spontaneous process, but artificial and compulsive. But the natural concern and warmth for others will come if you persevere on this road. As long as you cannot admit that you are human and that you need help in exposing your vulnerabilities, you cannot form real relationships. Thus, your life will remain empty, at least in some important areas. So I think we might pause for a second here. I don't know, there's a few more question and answers. It's 9. I don't know if people feel, like they've taken in completeness. So let me just check in. We can, sometimes the question and answers are related, sometimes they're not. I didn't read these in advance. How are people feeling? Are they able to absorb more? This has been a lot, right? So give me a thumbs up if you want to go more, or
I think I'm maxed out myself.
okay, you're maxed out.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
It's been
So
good.
you can always take a look at these Q&As, they're available as well. And I'll take a look at them, and if they feel important, maybe we'll review them for next time. But I think we can go ahead and. Hi, Lori, are you back? Have you been with us? I didn't know whether you had dropped you, or I couldn't just see you.
Yeah, I turned it off to feed the dog. He was kind of
Okay.
begging. Yeah, this is one that like, I don't know, I try not to beat myself up,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking. I hope it wasn't, too intense, because
Yeah,
there's.
no, I mean, I like the questions that people asked too, because it was good reflection.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, and it is, again, this kind of double-edged sword. So like it's a little scary to kind of, you know, find this place of seeing ourselves more clearly without doing any, self-judgment. And when it happens, it's like it's just also saying that, we're still healing on that level as well. And so, one of the things that I work with on my Sunday evening, I have a little process group that we're doing this interrelationship focusing, and there's a useful technique with that around observing all of these parts of us without merging. Usually what happens when we get caught in our struggle and in our uncomfortable and painful dynamics is that we're either merged with one of the voices inside of us that tells us we're bad, or or we're resistant and we're trying to defend against that voice inside of us that tells us that something's wrong with us. And so to allow ourselves to just be present and notice all of these voices inside of us, and we have many more than just those two, but we can say a nice phrase to use is, I notice something inside me wants my attention, and then the noticer becomes this higher self that can then be open and be curious and be compassionate to what is arising, even if it is a kind of angry critic, or something that we might be tempted into falling into. So it doesn't always prevent it, but it's a good support. And that is the work, in a way, is just waking up out of those trauma trances, because those are always connected with our old traumas. Okay, Jen, any other comments, or how was this for you?
It was great. It was, I have the book somewhere, so I'm going to find it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And I mean, you're always welcome to read in advance, but I find oftentimes just the spontaneity of what comes up in the sessions
Yeah.
and stuff is great too. So, all righty. Thank you, everybody, so much.
Thank
I'm gonna,
you.
like, stop to
Thank
share
you.
here,
You too.
and so we can just see each other for a minute to say goodbye. I guess we lost Frank. I think he may have.
He had to walk the
Yeah.
dog. He left us a note.
Okay. All right. So, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good evening.
Thank you
We'll
so much.
continue in 2 weeks. So,
Okay, great.
Good night.
see you then.